in the warm silence of ancient Syracuse, where the sea whispers of distant lands, there lived a man who saw the world differently. While others chased wealth and power, Archimedes pursued something quieter, the hidden laws that govern everything around us. He could spend hours watching a drop of water, a shadow moving across a wall, a circle drawn in sand. And in these simple things, he found answers to questions others never dared to ask. But one day, a problem would come to him that changed not only his fate, but the course of history itself. The secret of gold, the power of the lever, the siege of a great city, all of it would become part of his journey. And before the night covers the world completely, we will walk that journey with him, from quiet contemplation to a legend whose name has outlasted centuries. Close your eyes. It begins with a circle drawn in sand, not the restless sleep that comes to cities enduring war or famine, but the deep, peaceful sleep of a place that knows its own worth and needs no constant reassurance of its significance. Syracuse was great, one of the largest Greek cities in the Mediterranean, a port through which goods and ideas from all over the known world passed. They could afford to sleep soundly. The night wind blew in from the sea. It carried with it the scent of salt and seaweed, and something else, that elusive quality found only in the sea air at night, when the daytime bustle has faded and the sea ceases to be a backdrop for human affairs, becoming itself. Vast, alive, existing by its own laws, which ask no permission from people. The stone walls of the houses retained the warmth of the day that had passed. If you pressed your palm against them, they were warm, as if alive, slowly releasing their stored heat, unhurried in their own rhythm. The harbor below gently rocked the ships, from Carthage, from Alexandria, from Athens, from places that had no Greek names, because the Greeks had not yet reached them. The masts swayed barely. The ropes creaked softly. The water lapped against the stone piers with that soft, repetitive sound, which is one of the most ancient sounds ever heard by the human ear. It was a city where everything came together. Trade and philosophy, politics and poetry, wealth and poverty, living just a few blocks apart. People who had come from different places, with different gods and different customs, who had learned to coexist, not because they loved one another, but because the harbor was good, and the benefits were mutual. Syracuse knew how to welcome different people. And among these different people lived Archimedes. His house stood not far from the temple, not by chance, because in those days knowledge and the sacred had not yet parted ways completely. They still existed side by side, without claiming to destroy one another. The house was simple, not poor, but not rich in the sense in which wealth is flaunted. It had no superfluous decorations, no objects acquired, not because they were needed, but because they told others something about the owner. Archimedes didn't think about what his house said about him. He rarely thought about what other people said about him, not out of arrogance, not out of indifference to people as such, but simply because his mind was occupied with other things, constantly, almost without a break, with things that seemed to him far more interesting than his neighbors' opinions about his lifestyle. It was said, and it was true, that he could forget about food, not because he neglected his body or considered it unworthy of attention, but simply because his thoughts sometimes wandered so far away that returning to the physical required an effort that, at that moment, was harder to make than to keep thinking. Servants would sometimes bring him food and set it down nearby, and find it untouched several hours later, because he had never remembered that it was there. It wasn't a pose. It was simply the way he was wired. Sometimes they found him on the shore, alone, far from the city, where the shore became rocky and deserted, where there were no fishermen and no merchants, where there was only sand and stones, and the sea stretching toward the horizon. He was drawing. Not paintings, lines, circles, arcs, straight lines, geometric shapes that he drew right in the sand, using a stick or just his finger, crouching down and looking at what was taking shape with the expression a person has when they see something important and want to make sure they're seeing it correctly. The sea at his feet sometimes came too close. A wave would roll up to his drawings and erase part of them. He didn't get angry. He'd take a stick and draw again, sometimes the same thing, sometimes a little differently, because the erased version had already served its purpose, and the next one might be more precise. What was he looking for in these circles? Simple words cannot answer this question. He was seeking an understanding of how space is structured, how shapes relate to one another, which properties are random and which are constant under any conditions. What is a consequence of what and why it is this way and not another? He sought laws, not in the sense of rules established by people, but in the sense of the structure of the world itself, which exists regardless of whether anyone knows about it or not. He considered these laws to be more real than most of the things people usually call real. Archimedes did not seek fame. It is important to say this, not as a compliment, but as a fact, because that is exactly how he was. Fame interests people for whom their place in the eyes of others is part of who they feel they are. Archimedes felt differently. His place was determined not by how others saw him, but by how close he had come to understanding what was important for him to understand. When he discovered something, uncovered a pattern he hadn't seen before, proved a statement that had previously been only a hypothesis, he felt satisfaction, deep, genuine, unlike anything else, not because now other people would know about it and appreciate him, but because he himself now knew. And the world had become a little more understandable than it was an hour ago. That was his currency. Understanding. He was interested in simple things. Water, how it behaves when a body is placed in it, how it displaces, how this displacement relates to weight and volume. A stone, how it holds up if supported by a lever, and how the same effort of the hand can lift different weights depending on the point of application. The motion of bodies, how they roll, fall, fly, and what laws govern this motion if you look closely enough. Nothing exotic, nothing that couldn't be found in any house, on any shore, in any yard. But most people looked at these things and saw simply things. Water, stone, motion. Archimedes looked and saw questions, and behind the questions lay answers that waited until someone asked them precisely enough. The ability to see questions where others see only things is a rarity. Not because people are stupid, but because this way of seeing requires a special kind of attention. Slow, patient, ready to linger on a single object longer than seems necessary. Most people move on when a thing ceases to be new. Archimedes stayed because novelty didn't interest him. What interested him was what lay beneath it. That night, when the city was especially quiet, he sat by the window. Not because he couldn't sleep. He could sleep, and did sleep when his body demanded it. It was just that this night offered something special, a particular quality of silence in which thought moves differently than during the day, without the noise of the marketplace, without the voices in neighboring houses, without all that background noise that is the norm of daily life, and which, it turns out, occupies a part of our attention, even when we think we don't notice it. At night, that background noise is gone. And in this silence, thought becomes clearer, more precise, less scattered, better able to hold on to a single thread, without losing it under the pressure of others. He listened to the sea breathing. That was exactly it. Not just the sound of the waves, but the sensation of breathing. Approaching, a pause, retreating, approaching again, another pause, another retreat. A rhythm that existed before humans and will exist after them. A rhythm that knows neither haste nor fatigue, nor the need to get anywhere. He listened to this rhythm, and in his mind, slowly as everything real comes, a thought was born. Not suddenly. It's important to say this, because great discoveries are often described as sudden flashes of insight. A spark, and everything became clear. Reality works differently. A flash of insight is the moment when long work finally comes together, at a point where everything converges. But before that point, there is always a long process. Observation, reflection, attempts that yield no results, questions that remain unanswered for weeks and months, and a gradual, barely perceptible movement toward understanding that happens so slowly, it is almost impossible to feel it as it unfolds. Archimedes had been moving toward this idea for a long time. He had noticed long ago, not just for a day or a month, how water reacts to submerged objects, how it is displaced, how the water level changes, how different objects displace different amounts of water. He had thought about this in various contexts, from different angles, taking his time to reach a conclusion, allowing his observations to accumulate. And that night, to the sound of the sea, and in the silence of the sleeping city, something came together. Not completely. Understanding rarely comes completely in a single moment, but enough to feel, here it is. Here is what I was looking for. Here is the connection I felt, but couldn't yet put into words. He sat by the window. The sea was breathing, and the thought that was born in his mind that night was one of those that change the way people understand the world. Not immediately. Such things never change anything immediately, but forever. Later, they will say that he realized it in the bathtub. They'll say he jumped up and ran through the streets, shouting a single word, the one that in his language meant, "I've found it." They'll say he was so overwhelmed by the discovery that he forgot everything else. Maybe a man who could forget about food for the sake of a thought could well have forgotten about clothes for the sake of a discovery. But before that happened, before the moment of recognition and the joy that followed it, there was that night, that silence, that slow sound of the sea, and the man by the window listening to the world with that special attention which is, perhaps, the rarest of human gifts. An attention that does not rush, that does not demand a result before its time, that is capable of waiting for months, for years, until the world itself says what it wants to say, and then hears. The morning after came quietly, as mornings in Syracuse always did. The city woke in its own time, the harbor first, with the sounds of the docks resuming their work, ropes and wood and water, and the voices of men who had been doing this long enough that they no longer needed to think about it. Then the markets, then the streets, then gradually the whole dense human machinery of a wealthy Mediterranean city finding its rhythm for another day. Archimedes was already awake. He had slept briefly, incompletely, and risen before the light was fully established in that particular hour that belongs to no one specific part of the day. He had sat for a while in the same chair by the window where he had been the night before, looking out at the harbor, listening to the water. The thought from the previous evening was still with him, not fully formed but present, like something glimpsed at the edge of vision that disappears when you turn to look at it directly, but remains when you look slightly away. He was still turning it over when the messenger arrived. King Hieron II of Syracuse was not a man who sent messengers without reason. He had ruled the city for decades, carefully, intelligently, with the particular combination of shrewdness and restraint that allows a ruler to remain in power long enough to become genuinely experienced at it. He was not given to panic or to impulsive decisions. When he sent for someone, it was because something required attention that could not wait and could not be handled by anyone else. Archimedes received the summons without particular surprise. He had a relationship with the king that was unusual, not quite friendship, because the distance of power makes true friendship difficult, but something like mutual respect between men who understood that they each possessed something the other lacked. Hieron had authority and resources. Archimedes had the ability to think about problems in ways that produced results. The arrangement had served them both. He dressed and went. The palace of Hieron was positioned to overlook the harbor, a practical choice for a ruler whose power depended significantly on what came and went through that harbor, and also an aesthetic one, because the view was genuinely remarkable. From the upper rooms, you could see the full sweep of the bay, the ships at anchor, the open sea beyond, and on clear days, the distant shapes of the Sicilian interior rising against the sky. Archimedes noticed none of this on the way in. He was thinking about water. Hieron received him in a room that was large without being ostentatious. The room of a man who understood that genuine power does not need to announce itself through decoration. There were maps on one wall, and a table, and chairs, and a crown sitting on a cloth in the center of the table. The crown was the reason for the meeting. Hieron explained the situation directly, as was his way. The crown had been commissioned as an offering, a significant one, made from gold of a specified weight. The goldsmith had delivered it. It was beautiful. It weighed exactly what it should. By every outward measure, the commission had been fulfilled. But something had reached the king's ear. A rumor, a suspicion, the kind of thing that a ruler learns to take seriously, even when he cannot verify it, because a ruler who ignores small doubts sometimes finds them growing into large problems. The suspicion was this: the goldsmith had not used pure gold. He had taken some portion of the gold provided, replaced it with silver, which was cheaper and lighter, and crafted the crown from the mixture. The crown would weigh correctly, because silver had been substituted at a proportion that preserved the total weight. But it would not be pure gold. Hieron needed to know. He could not simply have the crown melted down and tested. That would destroy the offering. And if the goldsmith was innocent, it would be a significant injustice. He needed another way, a way to determine the truth without destruction. This was why he had sent for Archimedes. Archimedes looked at the crown. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, set it down, looked at it from a different angle, picked it up again. A pure gold crown of this weight would have a specific volume, because gold has a specific density, a specific ratio of mass to space occupied. A crown of the same weight but containing silver would have a larger volume, because silver is less dense than gold, meaning that to achieve the same weight, you need more of it, and more of it takes up more space. So the question was not about weight. It was about volume. If he could measure the volume of the crown precisely, he could compare it to the volume that a pure gold crown of that weight should have. Any discrepancy would reveal the substitution. The difficulty was the shape. A crown is not a simple geometric form. It is irregular, decorated, full of curves and projections that make direct geometric calculation impossible, or at least impossibly complex. You cannot calculate the volume of a crown the way you calculate the volume of a cube or a sphere. The mathematics simply does not offer a straightforward path. He thought about this as he walked home. He thought about it through the afternoon, barely eating, barely noticing the people around him. He sat with it through the evening. He walked through the city as the light faded, moving through streets without seeing them. Present in body and entirely elsewhere in mind. Problem was real and clean, and he could feel the shape of its difficulty the way you feel the shape of an object in darkness, by moving your hands carefully around it without quite reaching its center. The answer was somewhere. He could feel that too, but he could not yet see it. Several days passed. This is the part of the story that tends to be omitted in the retellings, because it is less dramatic than what comes before and after. The crisis of the commission, the moment of discovery. Between them, days of ordinary life, in which a man carried an unsolved problem through his daily existence and gave it the kind of patient, undirected attention that is the actual substance of most intellectual work. He observed water, not with any specific intention. He had always observed water, had always been interested in how it behaved, what governed its movement and its displacement. But now he observed it with the particular quality of attention that comes when you are carrying a problem, and the world around you is being unconsciously scanned for anything that might be relevant. He noticed things he had noticed before, but not thought about in quite this way. How water fills the shape of whatever contains it, how it moves to accommodate what is placed into it, how the level changes when something enters, rises precisely by the volume of the thing that entered. The volume of the thing that entered. He turned this over without quite grasping it yet. The way you turn a key in a lock that is almost but not quite the right key, feeling the mechanism engage partially, knowing you are close. The bath was a practical matter. He had been thinking for days, and his body required attention. And he went to the public baths, as one goes to the public baths, without particular thought, for reasons of hygiene rather than insight, intending simply to wash and return to his thinking. He lowered himself into the water, and the water rose. Of course it rose. Water always rose when you lowered yourself into it. This was simply how water worked. He had seen it 1,000 times. But in this moment, carrying this problem, having turned these particular thoughts over for these particular days, in this moment the rising water was not simply water rising. It was volume. His body had a volume. That volume displaced water. The water rose by exactly the amount of his body's volume. And if he could measure how much the water rose, if he could measure the displacement, he would know the volume of whatever had been placed into it. Any object, any shape, no matter how irregular, lower it into water. Measure how much the water rises. That measurement is the volume of the object. He sat very still in the water. the bath around him, the sounds of the public bathhouse, the other people present, all of it went away. There was only the thought, arriving now with the completeness of something that has been building for a long time and has finally found its form. A crown of known weight, made of pure gold, placed in water. The water would rise by a specific amount. That amount corresponded to the volume of pure gold of that weight. If the crown contained silver, it would be larger. The same weight, but larger volume, because silver takes up more space per unit of weight, and a larger volume would displace more water. The water would rise more. The measurement would be different. The difference would reveal the truth. What happened next is one of the most repeated stories in the history of human thought. He ran. Not walked, ran. Through the streets of Syracuse, a grown man, a respected scholar, a person who was, by all accounts, not given to public displays of emotion, running through the streets in a state that eyewitnesses apparently found remarkable enough to remember and repeat, until the story reached written form. He shouted one word. Eureka! I have found it. But something is lost in the dramatic retelling. The running, the shouting, the naked philosopher in the street. This makes a memorable story. It is vivid and human and slightly absurd, which is why it has survived. And it is probably true in its essentials, or true enough. People who find something they have been searching for with great intensity do sometimes respond with more physical expressiveness than their usual temperament would suggest. But beneath the running and the shouting was something quieter, something that is harder to tell in a story precisely because it is quieter, because it does not translate into action, does not make a scene, does not give you something to picture. What Archimedes felt underneath the elation was satisfaction. Deep, genuine, specific satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of having beaten someone, or proven something to a skeptic, or achieved recognition. The satisfaction of having understood something real, of having looked at a problem long enough and carefully enough that the world finally showed him its answer, of having been patient when patience was required, and attentive when attention was required, and willing to sit with not knowing until knowing was ready to arrive. The world had a law. It had always had this law. Bodies displace fluid in proportion to their volume, and this was true before Archimedes, and would be true after him, and had nothing to do with him personally, except that he was the one who had looked at it carefully enough to see it. And now he knew it, and knowing it, he could answer the king's question. He could measure the crown. He could determine whether the goldsmith had been honest or had taken something that did not belong to him. He could do this without destroying anything, without guessing, without relying on suspicion or accusation, only on measurement, and the law that made measurement meaningful. This was what he ran through the streets of Syracuse to announce, not his own cleverness. The law the measurement was made. The crown was placed in water. The displacement was measured. The displacement of a quantity of pure gold equal in weight to the crown was measured. The numbers were compared. They were different. The goldsmith had been dishonest. The crown contained silver. Hieron had his answer, and justice, in whatever form it took, could proceed. The historical record is not entirely clear on what happened to the goldsmith. What it is clear on is that Archimedes had solved the problem, not through guesswork or intuition alone, but through a method, a repeatable, reliable method that worked because it was grounded in something true about the physical world. And that method outlasted the crown, outlasted the king, outlasted the city. It is still being used. Late that evening, Archimedes sat again by his window. The harbor below was settling into its nighttime quiet. The ships rocked gently. The water moved in the way that water always moves. He looked at it. He had spent his life looking at water, at its behavior, its patterns, what it revealed about the objects that moved through it. And today he had found one of its deepest secrets, one of the ways in which it could be used to know something true. He was not thinking about what would happen next, not about the king or the goldsmith, or whether anyone would remember this. He was simply here, in this chair, looking at the water, satisfied. The world had told him something, and he had been quiet enough, and patient enough, and attentive enough to hear it. Fame arrived the way it usually arrives for people who are not looking for it. Gradually, from the outside, in the form of other people's reactions, rather than any internal change. The story of the crown spread through Syracuse quickly, as stories do in cities where people have time to talk and something worth talking about. It spread beyond Syracuse too, along the trade routes, in the conversations of merchants and sailors who carried news as naturally as they carried cargo, from port to port across the Mediterranean world. The name Archimedes attached itself to the story, and the story carried the name to places he had never been and would never go. He remained, through all of this, entirely himself. The same man who had walked the streets of Syracuse for days with an unsolved problem in his head, barely noticing the people around him. The same man who forgot to eat when a thought took him far enough. The same man who crouched on the rocky shore in the morning and drew circles in the sand with a stick, indifferent to the tide that came and erased them. Recognition changed none of this. It could not have, because the things that drove him had nothing to do with what other people thought. He was not working toward reputation. He was working toward understanding. And understanding, once found, does not become more real because more people know about it. The law governing the displacement of water was not more true after the king acknowledged it. It was the same truth it had always been, waiting to be found by anyone willing to look carefully enough. He had looked. He had found it. And now he was looking at something else. The lever had interested him for years. Not as a tool. Everyone used levers, had used them since before history was written, to move stones and raise beams and lift things too heavy for unaided human strength. The lever as a tool was familiar. What interested Archimedes was the lever as a question. Why did it work? What was the principle underneath the practice? What was the exact relationship between the length of the lever, the position of the fulcrum, and the force required to move a given weight? These were not the same question. Most people who used levers never asked any of them. They knew from experience that a longer lever made heavy things easier to move, and that was sufficient for practical purposes. Practical purposes satisfied them. Archimedes was not satisfied by practical purposes. Practical purposes were, for him, almost beside the point, a byproduct of understanding, not its goal. He observed. He experimented in the careful, methodical way that feels less like experimentation and more like extended conversation with the physical world. He moved weights along beams, shifted fulcrums, measured the forces required, compared his measurements against each other. He looked for the pattern that governed all of it, the single relationship that would make all the individual observations make sense together. And he found it. The law of the lever, the precise mathematical relationship between the distances from the fulcrum and the weights at either end, was not complicated. It was, like most deep truths, simple in its statement and profound in its implications. The weight on one side, multiplied by its distance from the fulcrum, equals the weight on the other side, multiplied by its distance. Always, without exception, regardless of the specific weights or distances involved. This was the law, and from this law followed something that stopped him when he first understood it fully. Something that required a moment of stillness to absorb. If the relationship was purely mathematical, if it depended only on the ratio of distances and weights, then there was, in principle, no limit to what could be moved with sufficient mechanical advantage. A large enough difference in distance from the fulcrum, and any weight could be moved by any force. Any weight. He said it plainly, as he said most things. Give me a place to stand, and I will move the world. People who heard this sometimes laughed. The obvious impossibility of it, the audacity of the claim. But Archimedes was not being audacious. He was being precise. He was stating a logical consequence of a mathematical law that he had proven, not boasting about personal capability, but describing what the law implied. If the law is true, and he had demonstrated that it was, then the statement follows from it. You would need a lever of impossible length, a fulcrum that did not exist, a place to stand outside the earth itself. These were practical obstacles of an insurmountable kind. But they were practical obstacles, not theoretical ones. The mathematics did not prohibit it. The mathematics required it. This distinction mattered to him. The difference between what was physically impossible and what was mathematically prohibited was not a trivial one. It was the difference between a limitation of our circumstances and a limitation of the world itself. The lever could not move the earth because we had nowhere to stand. not because the law broke down at large scales, not because nature placed a ceiling on what mechanical advantage could achieve. He found this significant. More than that, he found it beautiful. He built machines. This was the part of his work that the world noticed most immediately, because machines do things that people can see and use and be impressed by. The mechanical arrangements he designed for lifting heavy loads, systems of pulleys and levers working together, multiplying force through successive stages, allowed workers to move weights that would otherwise have required many times the manpower. He demonstrated one of these for Hieron himself. A ship, a large one, fully loaded, had been drawn up onto the beach. Moving it back into the water under normal circumstances required the labor of a great many men. Archimedes arranged his system of ropes and pulleys, handed the end of the rope to the king. Hieron pulled, with the effort of one man pulling a single rope, and the ship moved. The witnesses were astonished. Archimedes was not astonished. He had known it would work because he understood why it worked. The machine was not magic. It was not even particularly clever, in the sense that it did not require insight of the kind that the crown problem had required. It was simply the application of principles he had already proven, arranged in a configuration that made their effects visible and useful. What the witnesses saw as remarkable, he saw as obvious, the inevitable consequence of laws that were always true, now made visible in a form that people could watch and touch and wonder at. He did not begrudge them their wonder. He simply did not share it in the same way. His own wonder lived elsewhere, in the laws themselves, not in their demonstrations. More than anything, he loved silence. This was something that had been true his whole life, but which became more apparent as his reputation grew, and the demands on his time increased. People sought him out. Students, engineers, officials, curious visitors who had heard the stories and wanted to see for themselves the man who had found the secret of the crown and moved the ship and spoken about moving the world. He received them. He was not rude, not dismissive. He answered questions when questions were worth answering, explained when explanation served a purpose. But in the evenings, he returned to himself. He had a courtyard, a simple one, not large, stone paving, a few plants, the sky above it open and unobstructed. He would sit there as the light faded, watching the transition from day to night, from the ordinary visibility of the world to the different visibility that came with darkness. The stars interested him, not in the mystical sense. He was not a man given to mysticism, not given to projecting human meanings onto astronomical phenomena. What interested him was the order, the precision of it, the way the stars moved across the sky in patterns that were not random but governed, that could be predicted and mapped and described mathematically, that obeyed laws as surely as the lever obeyed laws. This was what the sky meant to him. Evidence that the world was not chaos, that underneath the apparent variety and unpredictability of everyday experience, there was structure. Reliable, consistent, mathematically describable structure. That the same principles that governed the movement of water in a basin governed the movement of bodies in space. That the universe was, in some deep sense, coherent, built on laws that held everywhere and always, without exception. He could not prove this fully. The mathematics of his time was not yet adequate to everything he suspected, but he could feel the shape of it, the way you can sometimes feel the shape of a room in darkness before you have seen it. From the way sound moves and air moves, and your own footsteps return to you. The world was ordered, and this order was beautiful. Not beautiful in the way that the crown had been beautiful, visible, ornate, designed to impress. Beautiful in the way that a proof is beautiful, in the way that a law is beautiful when you first understand it fully. When you see that it is not a rule someone invented, but a truth that was always there, waiting to be seen. He thought about this in the evenings, sitting in his courtyard while the stars moved overhead. The more he understood, the more clearly he could see this beauty. Not because understanding added something to the world that was not there before. The world was what it was, indifferent to whether anyone comprehended it. But because understanding cleared something away from the seeing, removed the noise and confusion and assumption that usually stand between a person and what is actually there. Like water becoming clear when the sediment settles. He had spent his life settling the sediment. Patiently, carefully, without hurrying the process, letting each question rest until it was ready to yield its answer, letting each answer lead to the next question without forcing the connection, trusting that the order was there, in the water, in the lever, in the stars, and that careful attention would eventually reveal it. And it had. Again and again, it had. He sat in his courtyard as the night deepened. The stars above him were the same stars that had been above him his whole life, above Syracuse, above the sea, above the shore where he had drawn circles in the sand and watched the tide erase them. They were the same stars that had been above the first people who ever looked up and noticed them, and they would be above the last people who ever did. They moved in their patterns, precisely, reliably, as they always had. He watched them for a while without thinking about anything specific, without calculating or formulating or working toward any particular understanding. Simply watching, letting the sight of them be what it was. Then he went inside. There was more to think about tomorrow. There was always more to think about tomorrow. The world was very large, and his understanding of it was, despite everything, still very small. This did not discourage him. It was the condition of the work, and the work was what he had. It began with ships on the horizon. Not one or two, a fleet. Roman warships moving toward Syracuse in the particular formation that experienced soldiers use when they expect resistance, but are confident in their numbers. There were many of them. The water between them and the city was crowded with the organized intention of an empire that had spent centuries learning how to take things that did not belong to it and keep them. Syracuse watched from its walls. The city had known sieges before, had been besieged, and had besieged others, had survived threats that seemed insurmountable, and had sometimes failed against threats that seemed manageable. It was an old city, a resilient one, built on a peninsula with the sea on most sides, with walls that had been repaired and strengthened over generations, with a population that knew the difference between a rumor of danger and danger itself. This was danger itself. The Roman general was Marcus Claudius Marcellus, experienced, methodical, accustomed to success. He had brought with him not just soldiers and ships, but the full apparatus of Roman siege warfare. Towers on wheels that could be rolled against walls, grappling hooks for scaling, artillery that could hurl stones and bolts over considerable distances. He had the resources of an expanding empire behind him, and the confidence of a man who had done this before. He did not expect the city to hold long. He was wrong. Archimedes had not sought this role. He was not a military man. He had no interest in conquest, no personal investment in the politics that had brought Roman legions to Sicilian shores. The conflict between Rome and Carthage, of which the siege of Syracuse was a consequence, was not a conflict he had chosen, or would have chosen. He was 60 years old, and his inclinations remained what they had always been. Toward his work, his courtyard, his observations, the questions that had occupied him for decades. But Syracuse was his city. He had been born here, had spent his life here, knew its streets and its harbor, and the particular quality of light on its water at different times of day. The people who would suffer if the city fell were people he had passed in the market and spoken to on the docks, and watched growing old over the decades of his own growing old. When the king's representatives came to him and explained the situation and asked what he could do, he listened carefully. Then he thought about it, the way he always thought about things, not with emotion, not with fear or anger or patriotic fervor, but with the particular quality of attention he brought to any problem, a problem with specific constraints, specific resources, specific goals. What are we trying to accomplish? What do we have to work with? What are the relevant laws? The laws of mechanics were the relevant laws. He understood them better than anyone alive. The cranes appeared on the walls first. The Romans approaching by sea saw them and did not immediately understand what they were. Large wooden structures mounted on the walls, extending out over the water. They might have been construction equipment, might have been something routine. The Romans were experienced soldiers and did not panic easily at unfamiliar sights. Then the cranes moved. Long arms swung outward over the approaching ships. Grappling hooks descended, iron hooks on heavy chains, dropping toward the Roman vessels with a speed and precision that suggested something more than improvisation. The hooks caught the prows of ships. The cranes swung back, and ships were lifted. Not entirely, not lifted free of the water like toys, but lifted at the bow, raised at an angle until the stern was pulled under the surface, until water began to pour in, until the vessel was no longer a fighting platform, but a disaster in progress. Then the hooks released, and the ship fell back, crashing against the water, damaged, disoriented, its crew thrown and shaken and trying to understand what had just happened. The Romans who watched from their own ships tried to understand it too. They had never seen anything like this. Neither had anyone else. The principle was not mysterious. A crane is a lever. The fulcrum is the pivot point, the structure around which the arm rotates. The relationship between the length of the arm on either side of the pivot and the weights involved determines what force is required to move what weight. Archimedes had worked this out in complete mathematical detail decades before the Romans appeared on the horizon. He had said, "Give me a place to stand, and I will move the world." The walls of Syracuse were a place to stand. The mathematics did the rest. He also understood light. The stories about mirrors are the ones that have been disputed most across the centuries. Whether he actually directed sunlight onto Roman ships and set them alight, whether the mirrors existed as described, whether the geometry of it was feasible. Later experiments have produced varying results. The historical record is not entirely clear. What is clear is that Archimedes understood the behavior of reflected light. He had studied it. He knew that curved mirrors concentrated light rather than dispersing it, that the geometry of reflection could be used to direct energy in ways that were not intuitive. Whether this knowledge produced burning mirrors during the siege of Syracuse, or whether the stories accumulated and grew in the retelling as stories do, the understanding itself was real. He knew how light behaved. He knew how force behaved. He knew how water behaved. These were the tools he had. Marcellus was a practical man. He had come to Syracuse to take it, not to be impressed by it, but after the first direct assaults on the walls and harbor had resulted in unexpected losses. Ships damaged, formations disrupted, soldiers demoralized by weapons they could not see the logic of. He made a practical adjustment. He stopped attacking directly. He settled in for a longer siege, cut off supply routes, waited. Time was on his side, he understood. A city under siege eventually runs out of what it needs, and patience was something Rome had always had in abundance. He is reported to have said something about Archimedes that has survived in various forms across the centuries. Something to the effect that they were fighting against a geometrician, against a man who sat safely behind the walls and used mathematics as a weapon more effective than any sword. The tone was not entirely without respect. An enemy who surprised a Roman general was not a negligible enemy, but the city fell, not to assault, to time, and to treachery, as cities often fall when assault proves too costly. After 2 years of siege, Syracuse was taken. The walls that Archimedes' machines had defended were finally breached. Roman soldiers moved through the streets. Marcellus had given orders, specific, clear orders, that Archimedes was not to be harmed. Whatever else happened in the taking of the city, the old man who had made their siege so unexpectedly difficult was to be found and brought safely to the general. Marcellus understood, in the practical way of experienced commanders, that what was in Archimedes' head was worth more than anything else in Syracuse. The soldiers who found him did not know who he was. Or perhaps they knew and did not care. In the chaos of a city being taken, orders from a general can seem distant and abstract, and the man crouching over something drawn on the ground, absorbed in it, apparently unaware that his city was falling around him, might have seemed like an obstacle rather than a treasure. He was killed. The accounts differ in their details. Some say he was working on a mathematical problem and told the soldier who interrupted him to wait that he needed to finish before he could go anywhere. Some say he simply did not move quickly enough. Some say other things. The details have been told and retold across 2,500 years and have inevitably changed in the telling. What the accounts agree on is that Marcellus, when he learned what had happened, was genuinely distressed, that he arranged a proper burial, that he expressed what appears to have been authentic regret, not performed mourning, but the response of a man who understood that something irreplaceable had been lost. During the siege, even in the days when the outcome was most uncertain, when the sounds of Roman activity outside the walls were constant reminders of what was at stake, Archimedes worked, not on the machines, or not only on the machines. In the hours between one crisis and the next, in the quiet of his courtyard, when the city had settled into uneasy nighttime silence, he continued thinking about the things he had always thought about: spheres and cylinders, the mathematical relationships between them, curves, and the areas they enclosed, the infinite series of calculations that could, approached carefully enough, yield exact results for problems that seemed to resist exactness. He had asked at some point in these years to have a specific diagram carved on his tomb when he died, a sphere inside a cylinder, a representation of a relationship he had proven, that the volume and surface area of the sphere were exactly 2/3 of those of the surrounding cylinder. He considered this one of his finest results. He was right to consider it so. But what matters here is not the mathematics. What matters is that he asked for it. That in the midst of a siege, with the city's future uncertain and the sounds of war never entirely absent, he was thinking about what he wanted to be remembered by, and what he chose was not the crown, not the ships, not any of the practical achievements that had made him famous. He chose a geometric relationship, a truth about the way spheres and cylinders relate to each other in three-dimensional space, because that was what mattered to him. Not the fame, not the siege engines, the mathematics, the order underneath everything, the beautiful, reliable, impersonal truth of how the world is built. The stars continued overhead. They had been there before the Romans arrived, and they would be there after the Romans were gone, and after Syracuse itself was gone, and after everything built by human hands in this part of the world had crumbled back into the ground from which it had been raised. The laws governing their movement would continue too. They did not need to be understood to be true. They had always been true. And somewhere, in the time that followed, in other cities, in other courtyard, in the minds of other people who looked at the world with careful attention, they would be understood again, more completely, more precisely. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Knowledge does not die when a person dies. It goes quiet for a while. And then someone else, looking at the same world with the same quality of attention, finds it again. Archimedes had found some of it. He had left it where others could find it. That was enough. The city had fallen. Not with a single dramatic moment. Cities rarely do. It happened the way most endings happen, gradually, then all at once. 2 years of siege had worn Syracuse down in the ways that sieges always wear cities down, through hunger and uncertainty, and the slow erosion of hope that comes when relief does not arrive, and the enemy outside the walls shows no sign of leaving. When the breach finally came, it came through a gate opened from the inside, through exhaustion and betrayal, rather than through any failure of the walls themselves. Roman soldiers moved through the streets. Some of them were disciplined. Some were not. The taking of a city after a long siege produces a particular kind of disorder. The release of 2 years of tension, the sudden permission to do what war usually prohibits, the chaos of men who have been frightened and cold and hungry and patient for a very long time, and have now been told that the waiting is over. Marcellus had given his orders clearly. Archimedes was not to be harmed. The streets of Syracuse were not quiet that day. There were sounds that belong to the taking of cities, and that do not need to be described in detail. They are the sounds of the end of one kind of order and the beginning of another, the sounds of a world being rearranged by force. People moved through them with the particular urgency of people trying to determine which way safety lay. And somewhere in the city, in a courtyard, on a quiet street, perhaps on the ground near his own house, an old man sat. He was drawing. This is the part of the story that has survived most clearly across 2,500 years, preserved in multiple independent accounts, told and retold not because it is dramatic, though it is, but because it says something true about who this man was, something that no biography and no list of achievements can quite capture. The city was falling. He was drawing circles. Not because he did not know what was happening. He was not senile, not confused, not unaware of the situation. He had lived through 2 years of siege. He had built the machines that had held the Romans off longer than anyone had expected. He knew, as everyone in Syracuse knew by this point, that the end had come. He sat down and drew circles anyway, because there was a problem he was working on, and the problem did not care about the Romans. What was the problem? The accounts do not agree on this detail, and perhaps it does not matter exactly. What matters is that it was a mathematical problem, geometric, precise, the kind that requires sustained, uninterrupted attention to hold in the mind clearly enough to make progress on it. The kind he had been working on all his life. He was 80 years old, approximately. He had been thinking about mathematics for 60 of those years, with the consistency and intensity that most people reserve for breathing. He had found the law of the lever. He had found the principle of displacement. He had calculated the value of P to a precision that would not be surpassed for centuries. He had developed methods for finding the areas of curved figures that anticipated, by nearly 2,000 years, the calculus that later mathematicians would build into a complete system. He had done all of this by paying attention, by sitting with problems longer than was comfortable, by refusing to move on before a thing was understood, by trusting that the order was there underneath the appearance of things, and that careful looking would eventually reveal it. He was still doing it, even now. The soldier who found him did not know who he was, or if he knew, if he had been told to look for the old man, the mathematician, the one the general wanted preserved. The recognition did not change what happened. He saw an old man on the ground, drawing in the dirt, apparently unaware that his city had just been taken. He spoke to him. The accounts differ on exactly what was said. Some say the soldier demanded that Archimedes come with him immediately. Some say he gave a name, told him who he was looking for, asked if this was the man. Some say he simply shouted, as soldiers shout. The way you shout at someone who does not seem to be paying attention. Archimedes looked up and said, "Do not disturb my circles." These were his last words. What happened immediately after is not entirely clear, whether the soldier acted in anger or in frustration or in the general chaos of a city being taken, where a man who would not move quickly enough became simply another obstacle. The accounts agree on the outcome. They disagree on the texture of the moment. Marcellus, when he learned what had happened, was genuinely distressed. This detail has survived because it was remarkable. A Roman general expressing authentic grief over the death of an enemy city's citizen. He arranged the burial. He ensured that what Archimedes had asked for was honored. the diagram on the tomb, the sphere inside the cylinder, the geometric relationship he had considered his finest result. The tomb was built. The diagram was carved. And the city that had been Syracuse became something else, a Roman possession, integrated into the expanding structure of an empire that would eventually cover most of the known world. But something remained. Not the tomb. The tomb was lost within a century or two, its location forgotten, overgrown. When Cicero visited Syracuse more than 100 years after Archimedes died, and went looking for it, he found it with difficulty, neglected, barely recognizable. He had it cleared and restored. He stood before the sphere and cylinder carved in the stone, and felt, he wrote later, something like awe, not at the man exactly, but at what the man represented, at the idea that a mind could be so completely oriented toward understanding that it remained oriented even at the moment of its own ending. Do not disturb my circles. Not save me. Not I am the one the general wants. Not let me go with you. I will come quietly. Do not disturb my circles. A man who had spent 80 years learning to see the order underneath things, asking at the last moment available to him for the only thing he had ever really wanted, a little more time with the problem. His discoveries did not disappear. They went quiet for a while, as knowledge sometimes goes quiet, when the civilizations that were developing it collapse or change direction. Some of his work was preserved in copies that survived. Some was rediscovered independently by later mathematicians who arrived at the same truths by different paths, because the truths were there to be found, and anyone looking carefully enough would eventually find them. The law of the lever is still the law of the lever. The principle of displacement is still the principle of displacement. The value of pi that he calculated still approximates the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, as it has always approximated it, as it will continue to do regardless of whether anyone is calculating. The sphere inside the cylinder, the relationship he was most proud of, the one he chose to mark his grave, is still true. The volume of a sphere is still exactly 2/3 of the volume of the cylinder that contains it. This was true before Archimedes proved it, and would have remained true if he had never been born, if he had never sat on a Sicilian shore drawing circles in the sand. He did not create these truths. He found them, and having found them, left them where others could find them too. There is something to be said for this, for the particular kind of permanence that belongs to understanding rather than to power or to fame. Marcellus, who ordered the siege and grieved for Archimedes, and died himself a few years later in an ambush in southern Italy, is a historical figure. His name is in the books. But what he built, the military campaigns, the political arrangements, the empire itself, has been gone for 1,500 years. What Archimedes found is still here, not as a monument, not as an institution, not as anything that can be pointed to and said, "There it is, that is the thing," but in the way that water behaves when you put something into it, in the way that a lever lifts weight with a mechanical advantage that precise mathematics can predict, in the way that engineers and physicists, and anyone who thinks carefully about how the physical world works, still uses, consciously or not, the same principles that an old man in Syracuse was thinking about when the end came for him. He is still here, in the water, in the lever, in the circle drawn on the ground that he asked at the last not to disturb. The sea outside Syracuse is still there. It moves the way it has always moved, the same rhythm, the same patient persistence, indifferent to everything that has happened on the shore beside it. The ships are different now. The city is different. The people walking the streets carry different names and speak a different language, and know things that Archimedes never knew, and cannot imagine things that he understood. But the water still rises when you put something into it. The lever still multiplies force in the exact ratio that he calculated. The sphere still fits inside the cylinder in the precise relationship he spent his life proving. If you look carefully enough at any of these things, at water in a bowl, at a simple stick balanced on a stone, at a circle drawn in the dirt, you are looking at what he saw, at the order he spent his life uncovering, at the truths that were there before him, and will be there after all of us, waiting quietly for anyone with sufficient patience and attention to find them. He was such a person, perhaps the most such person who ever lived. And perhaps that is what his last words really meant. Not defiance, not stubbornness, not the absent-mindedness of a man too lost in thought to understand his situation, simply the statement of a man who knew exactly what he was, and what he was doing, and what mattered. The circles mattered. They still do.